The graph of f is given. We want to use it to graph the following functions. So for part A, we want to graph y is equal to f of 2x. So first, let's take a look at this point here. This ordered pair here represents 0, 1. And this ordered pair here represents 1 and then 2. And then this ordered pair here represents 4, negative 1. And then this ordered pair represents 6, 0. So we're going to use those points to determine what our new graph is going to look like for each particular function. So for part A, okay, it's what we need to do is we need to graph. So to graph, we shrink the graph of f horizontally by a factor of 2. So what that means is, if we look at the ordered pairs, we have 0 and then 1, we have 1 and then we have 2, and then we have 4, and then we have negative 1, and then we have 6, and then we have 0. So what we need to do is we need to multiply by a factor of 2. So that means we're going to take 1/2 and multiply it by 0. And then we're going to take 1/2, multiply it by 1. The y value stays the same. Taking 1/2, multiply it by 4. The y value stays the same. And then 1/2 times 6. And then 0. So what do we end up getting for our ordered pairs? Well, we get 0, 1. We get 1/2 and then 2. We get 2, negative 1. And then we get 3, 0. So let's go ahead and plot our points. So we have 0, 1. We have 1/2 and then 2. And then we have 2, negative 1. And then we have 3, 0. So now if we connect those points, then we should get the following graph. For part B, we have y, which is equal to f of 1/2 of x. So that means to graph, we're going to stretch the graph of f horizontally by a factor of 2. So that means that we're going to take each point, so we're going to take 2 and multiply it by the x value. So it's going to be 2 times 0 and then 1 to give us 0 and then 1. We're going to take 2 and multiply it by 1, and so that gives us 2, 2. Again, we're going to take 2, multiply it by 4. The y value stays the same. So we're going to get 8, negative 1. And then 2 times 6, which gives us 12, and then 0. So we know that we have 0 and then 1. We know that we have 2 and then 2. We know we have 8 and negative 1. So there's 8 and negative 1. And then we have 12, 0. And so now when we graph, we can see that we stretch this horizontally. So there is the graph being stretched horizontally by a factor of 2. Okay, now for part C, we have y, which is equal to f of negative x. So that means we're taking the negative value and multiplying it by the input, which is x. So for part C, to graph, we reflect the graph of f about the x-axis. So that means we're going to take negative 1 and then multiply it by each x value. So we have -1 times 0 and then 1, which gives us 0, 1. We take -1, multiply it by 1, and that's going to give us -1 and then 2. And then we're going to take -1, multiply it by 4 to get -4, -1. And then we're going to take -1 times 6 to get -6 and then 0. So we have 0 and then 1. We have -1 and then 2. And then we have -4 and -1. And then we have -6 and then 0. So let's go ahead and draw those segments together, and we can see that the graph is reflected about the y-axis. Okay, now in part D, it's saying that we need to take a negative and multiply it by the function and also the negative times x. So that tells us that we need to, in order to graph, we're going to reflect the graph about f, about the y-axis, and then about the x-axis. So that means we're taking -1 and multiplying it by both ordered pairs. So we're going to take -1 and multiply it by 0. And take -1 and multiply it by 1. So we get 0 and then -1. We're going to take -1, multiply it by 1, and take -1 and multiply it by 2. So we get -1, -2. And then we're going to take -1 and multiply it by 4. Take -1 and multiply it by -1 to get -4 and then +1. And then we're going to take -1 times 6, -1 times 0, which gives us -6, 0. And now let's plot our points. So we have 0, -1, we have -1, -2, we have -4, and then +1, and then we have -6, and then 0. And now let's go ahead and connect our points. And so therefore, again, to graph, we reflect the graph of f about the y-axis and then about the x-axis.